Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss the introduction to the yellow wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And unfortunately, my voice is still a little rough, so please bear with any pauses or coughs or anything like that. This should be a shorter video, and then you'll go complete the homework, and then there will be a discussion video afterwards. The quiz will be both on this introduction and the discussion video, so make sure to refer back to this one as well. So let's begin here. So a little bit about Charlotte Perkins Gilman first. She was born in 1860 in Connecticut. Her father was a magazine editor, frequently left for long periods of time, so she spent a lot of time with her great aunts. So be thinking psychoanalytic criticism here and biographical criticism. An absent father ends up with these great aunts. Catherine Beecher, advocate of domestic feminism. This idea that women need to be liberated from the domestic life, that the domestic life was holding them back, which, if you think about it, is still a problem in our modern era. That even though women are in the workforce in equal numbers as men, women still do over 85% of the housework. So you can imagine that holds women back in many ways. She was also, another of her aunts was Isabel Beecher Hooker, an ardent suffragist, fought for the right of women to vote, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, abolitionist who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, so you can imagine with those three figures in her life and an absent father, it's going to shape her psychology quite a bit, and shape her life's work quite a bit as well. In 1884, Gilman married Charles W. Stetson, a local artist. Soon after the birth of her first child, Gilman suffered a nervous breakdown. Within a few years, she had divorced her husband. She urged him to marry her closest friend and announced it was best that her husband and friend raise the child. CPG, the notorious CPG, was moving to California. So, suffers postpartum depression and nervous breakdown. And then in an unusual move says, I think it's better you raise the child. In California, Gilman needed money, so she turned to writing. She wrote poetry, short stories, and nonfiction. Her best known nonfiction work is Women in Economics, that argues that sexual and maternal roles of women have been overemphasized to the detriment of their social and economic potential. Thus, only economic independence could bring true freedom. So basically, this idea that as long as women were dependent on men for provision and income, there was no way that they could have equality. That this dependence creates an unequal power structure, and that unequal power structure creates unhealthy status and relationships for women. That as long as they're subjugated to that way, even by well-meaning men or well-meaning relationships, it's a power imbalance that leads them to be forced to accept things that they might not otherwise accept. It's one of the reasons why the divorce rate is lower among couples where the woman's dependent on the man financially. You can imagine why. She became well known for lectures on topics for women. She argued that women and men should share housework and that women should be encouraged to be independent and find work for themselves again. So this, what Gilman was fighting for in 1860, still has not come about in 2017. Women still do 85% of that housework. In 1900, CPG married George Houghton Gilman, her first cousin, and continued to write. Again, this idea of marrying your first cousin is a taboo in the U.S. It's viewed as something that we should be ashamed of, or that could lead to birth defects, when in actuality it's more just our cultural taboo, our wanting to be the opposite of England, where we revolted from, who had incest as part of their monarchy, right? So we became a society very afraid. We're the society with the most taboo on marrying our cousins. Over half the world, it's still a common practice. From 1909 to 1917, Gilman founded, edited, and wrote for the journal The Forerunner. She also co-founded the Women's Peace Party in 1915 with activist Jane Addams. I always find this interesting. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, people who fought for women's rights also fought for peace and pacifism. And if you think of this, why did those things go hand in hand so much? What happens in wartime that makes it tougher for women? So one, the men are leaving. So now the women have to both provide and take care of the household. Often the men are lost in war, or have a casualty or an injury to the point where it becomes incredibly hard for the woman to manage. Also, that when men come back from war, they're often changed. They're not the same. They become much more abusive, and it's less healthy relationship to women. On another level, you have the first victims in war are almost always women. It's part of our psychology, unfortunately, that men, one of the ways they show dominance is by taking other people's women and doing horrific things with them, and it happens in every war. Even armies who are considered the most well-meaning will often find this as a regular practice. So women's movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries almost always were also peace movements. The Forerunner focused on advocating for the rights of women, socialism, so like H.G. Wells believed that natural resources were the property of the entire population, not just whoever had the luck to be the landowners. And structural changes were needed to culture and family. One thing that Gilman criticized harshly was women's clothing. She said that fashionable clothes succeed in changing a dignified, strong, erect, steady, capable, enduring instrument, the human body, into a pitiful, weak, bending, unstable, slow, inefficient, easily exhausted thing, a travesty on the high for which we're built. So at that time, it's very easy to see her quote and say, yes, the clothing they had to wear was quite oppressive, right? Often the clothing they had would restrict them in so many different ways, to the point of even they would break ribs on purpose to be able to fit into those tiny waist outfits. So at the bottom here I put, do women's clothes still do this? And I guess I should be more specific about the this. Is women's clothing, or clothing in general, still harmful to women in different ways? And there's a number of ways to look at this. One of the ways that feminist critics argue often now is that much of women's fashion perpetuates gender norms and forces women to live up to beauty standards of that time, right? And if you look at our society, What we see a lot now is we have almost 14 million surgical procedures each year, vast majority done by women to try to perfect their bodies. We have the proliferation of eating disorders. We have extreme depression, and rates of depression and eating disorders have tripled over the last decade. So these problems are actually getting worse, and a lot of feminists now, and scientists actually now, tie that to a lot of clothing choices. But even in other ways, our clothes restrict us in different ways. For instance, men or women's shoes. You can think women's shoes distort and often will wreck women's feet, create horrific pain and problems, because they're meant for fashion rather than health of the foot. But even among men, if you took a Nike shoe from 1980, it was much healthier for your feet than Air Jordans now. The average Air Jordan now is not healthy for your feet, doesn't provide support, isn't made of high quality materials. Where in 1980, while they were still an athletic sneaker focused company, they had high quality materials, they had support, they had the health of the foot was their main objective. As Michael Jordan, as they became the company of Michael Jordan and became a fashion ideas company, that you wanted to be like Mike, right? Well, they had to pay Mike and other athletes later. They had to pay CEOs and boards of directors and all that. And when you do that, you can't make shoes that are as good, and you can't make them as healthy, because you need more money into the shoe to make them that way. So part of that, they farm out the labor, but part of that, they jack up the prices. So now we're paying, instead of $20 for a high quality shoe that's good for your feet, we're paying $500 for a shoe that's low quality and not good for your feet, because we want to be like this athlete, right? So clothing still does this in many respects. And fashion can be a problematic tool of oppression for women and harmful in general. So Gilman suffered from postpartum depression after she had her daughter. This disease is characterized by depression and fatigue, but was not linked at the time to the depression some women experience after having a baby. Her unsuccessful prescription from Silas Vere Mitchell led her to write The Yellow Wallpaper. We'll get back to that in a moment, but Vere Mitchell was one of the most famous doctors at the time that women were often sent to work on this. Gilman wrote that she based it on her own personal experiences through this disease, and it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. So one way to think about this then is that almost the act of writing this was meant to be therapeutic for her, and that perhaps therapeutic for the reader. But many at her time did not see it this way. A Boston physician made protest in a newspaper called The Transcript. Such a story ought not to be written, he said. It was enough to drive anyone mad just to read it. Another physician in Kansas wrote to say that it was the best description of incipient insanity he had ever seen, and begging my pardon had I been there. So asked if she was crazy. This quote shows how doctors and physicians during the 19th and 20th centuries thought that they knew what diseases or illnesses women were contracting and how to treat them. They also did not take the opinions of women, even about their own health, very seriously. And this is actually still problematic today. What a lot of people don't know is the vast majority of clinical studies are done on men. right? And so when you're taking a medication, when you're taking a treatment of any kind, most of the data on that treatment was geared towards men. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but the vast majority of the studies were done on men. And so if you're saying, take this pill and these are the only side effects, well, those were the side effects for the men who were in those trials, right? If you're a woman and being prescribed this pill, those side effects might be a little different for you, but those trials wouldn't have listed it, right? So that creates huge problems. And there's also been a lot of studies showing that doctors do not listen to women about their own health care, and that they often ignore what the women think or if there's been studies that show a man and a woman could go to a doctor, present the same symptoms, and the man will often be taken more seriously than the woman. The female oppression in medicine is obvious in the Yellow Wallpaper. Even the narrator would try to talk to her husband about how she felt or what she thought she would do, and these comments were brushed aside as if they were not worth anything. So Gilman was a patient of a Philadelphia physician, Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, and his famous rest cure. It was prescribed exclusively to women. The rest cure enforced in isolation, rest, and feeding, with electrotherapy and massage to counteract muscle atrophy. Patients were made infant-like. Treatment included strict limits on brain work, which he felt interfered with womanly duties. And there were many famous patients, writers, actresses, often women in the arts. Dr. Weir Mitchell was well aware that the rest cure was rather bitter medicine for his patients, who he probably deemed spoiled and restless. When they are bidden to stay in bed a month and neither to read, write, nor sew, and have one nurse who is not a relative, then rest becomes for some women a rather bitter medicine, and they are glad enough to accept the order to rise and go about when the doctor issues a mandate. Okay, so imagine this was you today, and you are suffering postpartum depression or some other ailment. You go to a doctor and they say, okay, we need to take away anything that might engage your mind at all, engage your body at all. We want you to just stay in a bed and not move for months, right? And at the end of that time, you're going to be so desperate to get out of that bed, all of a sudden, you're going to forget all about those other troubles, right? Well, that, on one level you think, well, yeah, you are going to be desperate, right? But on the other hand, what damage is that doing to you, doing that for a few months? That could definitely cause major psychological and physical damage, especially at that time when there were even fewer ways to help people from the damage that causes. So this has been studied by feminist historians and the misogynist implications of it. Women were considered cured by restoring them to a properly passive role or by subordinating them to an enlightened but dictatorial male will. So you become infant-like, completely under my control, completely submissive or submit, which is a theme we've been seeing with Connie, with Georgiana, etc. Forced into a childlike dependence, the patient was reborn, re-educated by the parental team of the subservient female nurse and godlike male doctor. Okay, so notice it's a team that would always do it. It was always a female and a male. And the female was always the subservient one, and the male was always the one with power. And so it was re-educating the women about what their correct role in society should be. One way we can see about how women were dismissed by the medical community is the word hysteria. Hysteria became a quintessential female malady, believed to be associated with mental disturbance associated with the womb. Okay, so they needed a term for crazy women's disease, right? And so what they said, well, let's take the Greek word for womb, and that'll be crazy, right? So you can see how misogynist that is. To this day, we still use hysteria and hysterical, which is Greek for womb, to represent craziness. Hysteria and femininity became co-terms, standing for extreme emotional states. It was a way to dismiss women. And again, this is still done in doctors' offices often. Oh, this woman's so emotional, she couldn't possibly tell us what's really going on. You need a much more logical male presence to figure it out. Okay, so just in general, before we dive into the story in the next video, the short story is about a woman suffering from postpartum depression. She waits to work and still be productive, but a physician along with her husband and brother give her the rest cure prescription. This is what causes her depression to escalate because she is unable to feel productive in society and becomes a recluse. The narrator's imprisoned both physically in her room and emotionally in her mind. In the end, she becomes the woman in the wall, or, well, we'll talk more about that as we go through. So some questions I want you to think about as you read. Who is the woman in the wallpaper? What allegorical elements could be interpreted from this story or social commentary? How is the act of tearing the wallpaper down a feminist act? What could creeping around symbolize? And probably most importantly, how does the point of view of the story impact it? How does it change our interpretation of the story? Okay, so now I want you to go do the homework. And again, keep in mind when you do the quiz, it'll be based on both this introduction and the discussion. Thanks.